In the introduction video, I told you that Flexbox worked on 95% of all browsers. But so far, the code that you've written has actually only worked on about 83%. And there's two major reasons why. The first reason is that there are old versions of the Flexbox syntax. The process for adding a new feature like Flexbox into the CSS language is complex and lengthy. It may seem like Flexbox is fairly new, but the first draft was actually done back in 2009. Since then, Flexbox has gone through two major changes, leaving us with three versions of the syntax. There's the 2009 version, which uses display box and has properties that begin with box. The 2012 syntax uses display flexbox, and the current version uses display flex. As of right now, it's extremely unlikely that the syntax will change again. But in order to make your Flexbox code work on as many browsers as possible, you still need to support the old versions of the syntax. You'll notice here on Can I Use that the Android browser only supports the old version of the Flexbox syntax, and Internet Explorer 10 only supports the 2012 version. The second reason why Flexbox doesn't work everywhere is vendor prefixes. My favorite explanation of vendor prefixes comes from Peter Paul Cook of Quirks Mode. He said, originally, the point of vendor prefixes was to allow browser makers to start supporting experimental CSS declarations. Let's say a W3 working group is discussing a grid declaration, which, incidentally, wouldn't be such a bad idea. Let's furthermore say that some people created a draft specification, but others disagreed with some of the details. As we know, this process may take ages. Let's furthermore say that Microsoft, as an experiment, decides to implement the proposed grid. At this point in time, Microsoft cannot be certain that the specification will not change. Therefore, instead of adding grid to its CSS, it adds MS Grid. The vendor prefix kind of says this is Microsoft's interpretation of an ongoing proposal. Thus, if the final definition of grid is different, Microsoft can add a new CSS property, grid, without breaking pages that depend on MS Grid. Let's take an example of some CSS from Chapter 1. This is what the CSS looks like when we wrote it. If we add the old versions of the syntax and the vendor prefixes in, it looks like this. You can see here that WebKit box represents the old 2009 version of the syntax, MS Flexbox represents the 2012 version, and WebKit Flex represents the current version but with vendor prefixes. When you're writing Flexbox, there are a ton of problems with including the old versions of the syntax and the vendor prefixes directly in your code. The first is that you're repeating yourself. Generally, as a developer, you shouldn't duplicate similar code when possible. The next is that you have to remember all of these different versions. It's a lot of extra work, and it doesn't really add any extra value. If you forget a prefix for a browser that you rarely use, then it's unlikely that you'll catch that. Finally, this code is really difficult to change and maintain. When you want to make a change, you have to do it in several places. Luckily, there's a fix for this, and it's AutoPrefixer. AutoPrefixer is a tool that automatically adds vendor prefixes and old versions of syntax to your CSS. It also translates properties to old version, and it even removes unnecessary prefixes. You can configure it to target specific browsers, and like magic, once it's turned on, you can forget you're using it. The easiest way to try out AutoPrefixer is with CodePen. CodePen is an online editor that lets you jump straight into coding. To give it a shot, click on the New Pen button. We can enable AutoPrefixer by clicking on the Settings icon next to CSS and clicking on the Radio button next to AutoPrefixer under Vendor Prefixing. From here, we can type in unprefixed styles into the CSS area, and AutoPrefixer will automatically generate the styles we want for us. CodePen is great for small projects, but most web development is done locally. Setting up a computer for development can get extremely complicated, but it's pretty easy with CodeKit. CodeKit is a program that lets you incorporate a ton of popular tools, such as AutoPrefixer, Sass, and CoffeeScript into your project. It's $32, but it's worth the money if you're not quite ready for tools like Gulp or Grunt. If you're not using OS X, Prepros is an alternative to CodeKit that works in both OS X and Windows. To get started, open up CodeKit and drag a folder into the main window. Unfortunately, CodeKit doesn't allow you to run AutoPrefixer on plain old CSS files. However, you can convert them to Sass files by renaming the extension to .scss. You can still write CSS in these files just like you normally would. To turn on AutoPrefixer, click on the Settings button, and then under Languages, click on the Special Language Tools. CodeKit automatically copies all of your compiled CSS files into a CSS directory, so I'd recommend keeping your source CSS files in an SCSS folder. In order to support all of the browsers that can display Flexbox, we need to change the AutoPrefixer browser string. That's it. Now, every time you make a change to one of your files, CodeKit will automatically compile it using AutoPrefixer. Gulp and Grunt are tools that make it easy to set up and build your projects. With them, you can set up powerful build systems that compile your files, run static analysis on your code, and even host local servers. Configuring this tool is a little too in-depth for this lesson. However, if you're curious, this is what my Gulp file looks like. You can incorporate AutoPrefixer into a Gulp file yourself by using Gulp AutoPrefixer. Many other frameworks also support AutoPrefixer, including Ruby on Rails, ASP.NET, Express, and CakePHP. Chances are good there's a way to incorporate AutoPrefixer into your favorite framework. So what happens if you can't use AutoPrefixer in your project? The first option is to use a library called Prefix-free. This library does the same thing as AutoPrefixer, but it does it in the browser. The downside is that it takes extra time and processing power to prefix the CSS, which can make your site feel a little slow, especially on mobile browsers. The other option is a tool called Please. Please lets you paste in CSS. It then uses AutoPrefixer to print out prefix styles so you can copy them into your own style sheets. However, if you have the ability, I would really recommend trying to incorporate AutoPrefixer into your project directly. And that's it. You've learned how to set up your environment to take full advantage of CSS without having to worry about vendor prefixes. Have fun.